Christmas night arrived quietly, the way it always did for Officer Daniel Carter, without warmth, without witnesses. The city looked peaceful from the outside, dressed in lights and artificial cheer, but from the driver's seat of a patrol car, it felt hollow. Daniel moved through empty streets with practiced ease, responding to minor calls that carried no urgency and even less human connection. He told himself he preferred it this way. Fewer people meant fewer expectations. Yet the silence pressed against him harder than any crowded shift ever had. When his shift finally ended, Daniel returned to an apartment that smelled faintly of cold air and disinfectant. The Christmas tree in the corner stood undecorated, bought weeks ago with good intentions and forgotten just as quickly. His phone remained quiet. No message from Megan, his long-term partner, who had chosen to spend the holidays with friends rather than acknowledge the tension between them. Their relationship had not collapsed, it had simply thinned out, worn down by routines and unspoken disappointments. They still shared space, plans, and history, but affection had quietly stepped out long ago. Daniel poured himself a drink he didn't want and sat on the edge of the couch, uniform still on, badge catching the dim light. He tried to remember when he had last felt chosen. Not needed, not relied upon, but truly seen. The answer didn't come, and that unsettled him more than the loneliness itself. Across town, in a modest apartment building with chipped paint and narrow hallways, Ethan Brooks was setting the table for two. The plates didn't match, and the food was simple, but he took his time arranging everything as if presentation mattered. For Lucas, it did. His 8-year-old son sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, carefully lining up toy cars in a crooked row. Ethan watched him with a softness that never quite left his face. Life hadn't unfolded the way he once imagined, but this quiet responsibility, this steady love, was something he had learned to protect. Ethan had grown used to being alone in ways that didn't hurt anymore. He had learned which questions to ignore, which glances to forgive. Being a gay single father came with a certain invisibility, but it also sharpened his awareness. He noticed things others missed: tone, posture, the weight behind a pause. Tonight, as snow tapped lightly against the window, he felt content, even if a small part of him wondered what it might be like to share the evening with another adult who understood him. The knock on the door came just as Lucas reached for his fork. Ethan hesitated, instinctively protective, before opening it to find Daniel standing in the hallway, hat tucked under his arm, posture formal but tired. The badge identified him before the uniform did. "Sorry to bother you," Daniel said. "We had a noise complaint." "Probably nothing." Lucas peeked around Ethan's leg, eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you a real cop?" he asked, voice bright and fearless. Daniel blinked, surprised, then smiled, an unguarded expression that felt unfamiliar on his own face. "I am," he replied, crouching slightly to Lucas's level. "But I think I got the wrong place." Ethan relaxed a fraction, sensing no threat. "We were just having dinner," he said. "No noise, unless you count bad Christmas music." Daniel glanced inside, noticing the modest decorations, the warmth that lingered in the air. It struck him how different it felt from his own apartment. "Looks like I interrupted something," he said, already stepping back. Before the door closed, their eyes met, not with recognition, but with a quiet understanding neither could name. Ethan saw the exhaustion Daniel carried, the kind that didn't come from long hours alone. Daniel saw a steadiness in Ethan, a calm he hadn't known in years. "Have a good night," Ethan said. "You too," Daniel replied, and meant it more than he expected. Back in his car, Daniel sat for a moment before turning the key. The encounter replayed in his mind, not because it was remarkable, but because it wasn't. No drama, no flirtation. Just warmth. Real warmth. It unsettled him how much that brief interaction lingered. Later that night, as Daniel lay awake beside Megan, listening to her steady breathing, he found himself thinking about a small kitchen table, mismatched plates, and a child who believed Christmas still mattered. He didn't want to think about it, but the thought returned anyway, persistent and quiet. Ethan, meanwhile, tucked Lucas into bed and lingered in the doorway longer than usual. The image of the officer's tired eyes stayed with him, stirring a curiosity he hadn't felt in a long time. He dismissed it gently, the way he had learned to dismiss many things, and turned off the light. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the city in a temporary calm. Neither man knew it yet, but something subtle had shifted, nothing dramatic, nothing reckless. Just the faintest crack in the lives they thought were already settled, and sometimes, that was where everything truly began. The days after Christmas slipped back into routine, yet Daniel Carter found that routine no longer fit him the way it once had. His patrol routes felt narrower, his apartment quieter. He told himself the lingering restlessness had nothing to do with the brief encounter at Ethan Brooks's door, but certain thoughts had a way of resurfacing when he wasn't paying attention. He drove past that building more than his assignment required, justifying it as habit, as vigilance. Each time, he felt the same quiet pull, unaccompanied by intention yet impossible to ignore. When Daniel finally ran into Ethan Brooks again, it was in daylight, under circumstances so ordinary they disarmed him. Ethan was carrying groceries up the front steps, Lucas trailing behind with exaggerated effort. One of the bags tore, spilling oranges across the pavement. Daniel reacted without thinking, kneeling to help gather them. "Seems like we meet again," Daniel said, offering a small smile. Ethan laughed softly, a sound that carried neither embarrassment nor caution. "I was hoping our last meeting wouldn't involve me dropping food in front of a police officer." Lucas watched them both with interest. "You're the Christmas cop," he announced. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. "Guess that's my new title." They stood there longer than necessary, conversation drifting from small talk to something easier. Ethan mentioned working from home, raising Lucas alone. Daniel spoke about night shifts and the strange way the city felt when most people were asleep. There was no rush to end the exchange, no awkward pause demanding distance. When they parted, Daniel realized he hadn't thought about time once. The meetings became accidental in name only. Daniel learned which mornings Ethan walked Lucas to school, which afternoons he returned home with his hands full. Sometimes they spoke for minutes, sometimes only long enough to exchange a look that said more than words. Daniel noticed how Ethan listened, fully, without waiting to reply. It made Daniel more careful with what he said, more honest than he intended to be. At home, the contrast grew sharper. Megan Carter spoke to Daniel about schedules and expenses, about obligations that felt inherited rather than chosen. He responded politely, attentively, yet something essential was missing. He began to recognize the space between them not as a phase, but as a quiet conclusion neither of them had wanted to name. One evening, as they sat across from each other in silence, Megan finally looked up. "You're somewhere else lately," she said. There was no accusation in her voice, only fatigue. Daniel hesitated. He could have denied it. Instead, he nodded. "I don't know how to fix what's been broken for a long time." The truth settled between them, heavy but honest. Megan didn't ask questions she already knew the answers to. They spoke late into the night, not with anger, but with a shared understanding that staying together had become an act of habit rather than love. When the conversation ended, nothing dramatic had changed, but everything had. Daniel slept alone for the first time in years and realized how long he had already been alone. Ethan sensed the shift before Daniel said a word. He had learned to read emotional distance, to recognize when attention carried weight. One afternoon, as they walked side by side, Ethan stopped near the corner where their paths usually split. "I need to say something," Ethan said carefully. "I don't get involved with people who are half present. Not for my sake, and not for Lucas's." Daniel met his gaze, surprised by the firmness beneath the kindness. "I wouldn't ask you to," he replied. "I'm figuring things out. Properly." Ethan nodded, accepting the answer without pressing. That trust, given but not surrendered, meant more to Daniel than reassurance ever could. Time passed with deliberate slowness. Daniel moved into a small apartment closer to work. Megan moved on quietly, without spectacle. The world didn't notice the change, but Daniel did. He felt lighter, unsettled, awake in a way that frightened him. He and Ethan continued to see each other, never crossing lines that would require regret. Instead, they shared coffee, conversations, silences that felt earned. One evening, Daniel joined Ethan and Lucas for dinner. Nothing ceremonial, nothing planned. Lucas showed Daniel his drawings, each one more elaborate than the last. Ethan watched them with guarded hope, careful not to imagine more than the moment allowed. Daniel noticed, and respected it as the night wound down, snow began to fall again, mirroring the quiet of the year before. Daniel stood by the door, coat in hand, reluctant to leave but unwilling to rush what hadn't yet found its shape. Same time next week? Ethan asked, not assuming an answer. Daniel smiled, steady and certain. I'd like that. He stepped into the cold with a sense of direction he hadn't felt in years, not toward a promise, but toward a possibility. Behind him, a door closed softly, not as an ending, but as a pause, and for the first time, that was enough to keep him moving forward.